Okay, I want to say Shalom Aleichem to everybody and to wish everybody a good Zummer. We're now in the summer, in the month of Iyar. We're holding Erev Lag BaOmer, and as I mentioned in the Erev Shabbos podcast of our Torah, that there's no question that it's very hard to go into this Lag BaOmer this year. We all remember it's the yard site. It's going to be the upcoming yard site of the 45 holy people, holy Kedoshim that were taken away from us last year on Lag BaOmer, and it just brings home very, very much the fact that the Avelus, which we know we keep in these days because of the Talmidim Rebbe Akiva, but we see that unfortunately it wasn't only Talmidim Rebbe Akiva, but unfortunately we have our own Talmidim Rebbe Akiva of our generation. It happens to be that on Lag BaOmer night I have a few simchas, and besides the few simchas, I have the yard site of Asi Koltai, Allah Shalom, from Her Han Har Nof, who was a young bar mitzvah boy. He passed away at that tragic event, and the parents are making a siyum, and I think they're making some other things that they're doing. So, and this is the time period that we're in, and on one hand we also have to tie it in with the theme of tonight, which I want to speak about. Is that happens to be that my father, Olav Shalom, who we're going to speak about tonight, Rabbi Yakov ben Rabbi Eliezer, Irene Kaparas Mishkavai, it's his 34th yard site. So I felt very, very apropos that the 34th yard site, what's so special about the 34th yard site? He's nifter, for many people here, 34 years, it sounds like a long time ago, but for myself, it's really like yesterday because I remember him so vividly, and I felt it would be very apropos that maybe I should speak a little bit about him, and especially in the lieu of the Gedolim series. So in my book, I speak a lot about Gedolim. One of those, the first Gadol who I got a chance to meet was my father, Allah Hashem. Now when I say those words, the first Gadol that I got to meet, it sounds a little bit of like little pat on the back. I'm the son of a gadol. It's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is that certain aspects of my father's life, he was a great, great Talmid Chacham and a great Marbitz Torah, and he's really the linchpin for myself. That if I have at all had a connection to Gedolim, it's only because my father's tutelage, my father teaching me the importance of Gedolim and his connection to Gedolim. So in that respect, he was a gadol. He was a gadol. And the 34th yard site happens to be that my father lived. He was nifter on Lamed Beis BaOmer. The Hebrew date is Yud Zayin here, and it's right before Reb Shimon's yard site. And we'll speak a little bit more about a connection, how that connects. But so this year it would have been his 100th birthday. It would have been his 100th birthday. My father was born in the United States of America, Washington, D.C., in 1922. And it's 100 years ago. So now, when I think about that, I kind of like put things into perspective for myself that, that my father was born 100 years ago. And it kind of puts into perspective for myself and maybe for you as well, the listeners and the viewers. Then we speak about 100 years. 100 years is a piece of time, and at the same time, it shows us how quickly time passes. How quick time passes. But the time period that my father was born in, I think it was unique in my father's upbringing, and it's somehow I feel that we can all relate to it. And that's really why I felt it's important. A lot of the Gedolim that I spoke about, like I was mentioning to Yisrael, I want to also give a shout out to Yisrael. We're finally back to each other. We want to give a shout out to JFoundations again for all of the wonderful, wonderful work that it does, and the opportunity for myself to be able to give out, and for people to be able to listen and to hear great people that we were zocheh to know, and we continue to aspire to get from them. So what I wanted to mention was that that 100 years ago, in America, the concept of Gedolim was kind of unheard of. And, today everything's so popular. We have Art Scroll, and we have Ami magazine, and we got Mishpacha magazine, and we got, everyone's used to the concept of Gedolim, the Gedolim. And my father grew up in a time period in the United States of America where Torah was not prevalent. It was a midbar shemema. And what he accomplished in his life is really a true testimony to not only his dedication, for sure his dedication and his hasmada and his perseverance, but it really shows the real message, which is that Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. No matter where a Yid is at all times, the Rebbeinu Shem is with him, and the Rebbeinu Shem is with Klal Yisrael. And a person can be born in a place, in a time where you might not think that, I'm ever going to be a great person. No, every single one of us has greatness in every single time period. Everyone think, when the Chafetz Chaim was around, then we had Gadol, right? And we had Reb Chaim Kanievsky. He grew up as a son of discipler, and he became the great Gadol he became. But I want to speak to you about my father, Olah Sholem, who didn't grow up in a house which was a Gedolim house. We don't know much about his parents because his father passed away at a very young age. When my father was only 14 years old, my father became a Yosem from his father. His father was in his mid-30s when he passed away, I think 36, 37 years old. And his mother lived for longer. And they were people that came from Kelm, and they crossed over the shores of the Atlantic Ocean from Lita, and they ended up in Washington, D.C. in the early 20s. And if I'm not mistaken, they had a very chashva rav that was Masari Kedushin at their chasna. And my father was born in 1922, I think 2 years after they got married. And he grew up in a society where no yeshivas, there were no day schools. Where do you go? You go to public school. His parents were hard workers. They're working. His father was a working person, and they didn't have the concept of what it was to send to yeshivas, because first of all there were no yeshivas, no opportunities, and the public school. Now he might have had some sort of afternoon Sunday school or a rebbe, maybe once or twice a week. We don't know much about that. But we do know is that when he became, because this we know from him, what he told us, that when he was, first of all, it's important to know, and we're going to touch upon this, besides being a great Talmid Chacham, he was also a great athlete. He loved sports, he played sports, and even when he became a rebbe at the yeshiva, he was known to be a champion handball player, which was the Jewish game. It was good for short guys. Okay, he had this four-walled enclosed area with a small, very hard rubber ball, and later on they used to wear gloves. Gloves used to slap the ball against the wall, and it was a whole chess game about how you won the points. It was like racquetball, but without a racket, and you had these gloves, and he became a very, very great player to such a degree that even when he became a rebbe when he was rebbe in the yeshiva, he still continued to play, not as often as he played when he was young, but he won championships. He won the city of Baltimore, he won the state of Maryland, he won the Eastern Seaboard, and we had medals and he had trophies, and we always used to the trophies that Daddy had, and. So he grew up in America. He grew up with baseball. He grew up with sports. And he was very lucky that when he was 12 years old, his mother said, we have to get him prepared for a bar mitzvah. How are we going to get him prepared for a bar mitzvah? He has to learn how to lane for the parsha. So they hired the Rebbe the Rebbe should teach him how to do the laning. It means he must have had rudimentary, he knew how to read and how to daven to a certain extent. But learning Torah, I don't know how much he had. He maybe learned some Mishnayos, maybe some Aschalas HaGemara. But the Rebbe was a very good Rebbe. His name was Mr. They used to call him Mr. Shofar. I heard his name was Rabbi Yakov Shofar. Some said he was a big Talmid Chacham. Many Talmidei Chachamim from Washington, D.C., from those days, they all were influenced by him. He had a tremendous, tremendous influence on my late father. My father spoke about him as being one of his primary Rebbes. He had a correspondence with him for years and years. They would send to each other postcards every day, daily postcards. That's in those days, they didn't have use phones. Use postcards to write to each other. And he was the one that influenced him in learning, and eventually, together with Rabbi Clavin, who I'm named after, who was the chief rabbi of Washington, they sent my father in 1937 to a fledgling yeshiva that was the only yeshiva gedola in those days. It really was a mechina and then a beis medrash, and that was Ner Yisrael, which was started by Rabbi Ruderman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And at that time, it was a very small crowd, maybe 25, 30 Talmidim in the entire yeshiva. My father was one of the first machzer. But from that time and onwards, he became a prodigious masmid, and he became very, very close to Rav Ruderman, and he became a Talmud Muvik from Rav Ruderman, and he became an accomplished Talmud Chacham. From a young boy coming from Washington, D.C., from a public school background, from a very, very little opportunity to learn Torah at that time, but in a very short time he became a Talmud Chacham, to the degree that when he was 16 years old, 15 or 16 years old, he once spent the whole Shabbos in the Beis Medrash, and he learned Masechta Beitza from cover to cover, and in one Shabbos. And the Rosh Yeshiva, how do I know the story? I heard it from a few people, but one of the people I heard about from was from the Rosh Yeshiva of Ruderman Zatzal, who told me personally at my bar mitzvah. He said that my father learned the Masechta one Shabbos, from the whole Shabbos. He didn't leave the Beis Medrash. He had people bringing him food into the Beis Medrash. He stayed there for davening. And Rav Ruderman saw that he was learning, and he was learning. And at the end of Shabbos, he saw that he finished the Masechta. But he thought he just learned it like Bekias. He just learned it like, he just ran through it. But he decided to give him a bechina, and he gave him a bechina. He gave him a test, and Rav Ruderman Zatzal told me that your father answered every single kasha of Tosfos, on the entire Masechta, which means he really, really had learned that Masechta, and he had really he understood it properly. So at a young age, he already became known as a masmid and as a baki. And then later on in life, he became known to be a person that finished Shas, and he learned Shulchan Aruch and Poskim, and he became a Rebbe in the yeshiva. He became a prominent Rebbe, and I think that even Yisrael's grandfather, Shabi Gesund Stark, Reb Shmuel Blum, was zeicher to learn. I don't know if he was in his shir or not, but I know he was close with him. And so we see that, the Rebbeinu Shalom watches over Klal Yisrael under all circumstances. I think it's very interesting that, my father's Petira took place the day before the Yom Hilula, the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And we know Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the 5 Talmidim that Rabbi Akiva taught Torah to, what's called the Rabbeinu Shebedarim, after the 24,000 Talmidim were nifter. And it says the world was shamim, the world was deathly silent and quiet because of the plague that took place, the 24,000 Talmidim that we're all in mourning for till today, that the world was like silent. That's it. There was no Torah. Rabbi Akiva was the Mosad Torah. Now it's all gone until he got this next group of Talmidim, and one of them was Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And from those 5 Talmidim, all of the Torah that we have today all emanates from that Torah. It's all brought down as far. That's really the reason why. Why do we have such avelus? 24,000 Talmidim, fine, but why does the whole Jewish world have to sit and have an aspect of mourning in these days? Because the answer is because the Torah was lost in Klal Yisrael. And only when Rebbe Kiva was able to reinstitute it by having the 5 Talmidim, including Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, was the world able to somehow come back. So all the Torah that we have today all comes from those Talmidim. So a great Talmud Chacham, Rabbi Yisrael Ber Kaplan, who was also a Talmud Muvak from Rav Ruderman and a Talmud Chaver of my father, he said on the hesped of my father that that to a certain extent my father was from those Talmidim, like Rav Ruderman was able to keep the Torah going in the United States of America when everything was being lost in Europe. So it was almost like the 24,000 Talmidim were taken away. And now all of a sudden it recouped and Torah began to sprout. If you think about it, you're going back, over 80 years ago, when my father was a Talmud in the yeshiva, close to 90 years ago, in Eretz Yisrael, how many yeshiva bachim were there in America? How many were sitting and learning Torah in such a darga, in such a level? And then he became a Rebbe, and he taught others, he became a Marbitz Torah, and he had an effect upon others. Today, we take a look at the Torah world. We have thousands and thousands of Talmidim learning the yeshivas. Lakewood has 9,000. The Mir has 9,000. This yeshiva's got 1,500, and this one's got 2,000. And there's kailalim, and there's opportunities, and the Torah abounds, and we have all the different programs. We have all the daf, and almost the daf. We have Stefanski's daf. We got everything. And it's gewaldic. It's gewaldic. But where did it all emanate from? It all emanated from those few Talmidim, who continued to learn the Torah when the Torah was shamim. So it's very, to a certain extent, very apropos that my father's patira took place almost at the time when there's the hefsek, when we can be happy again. That's what we look for. We look forward to Lag BaOmer. We're going to take a shave. We're going to be able to listen to music. We're going to go to chasnas, make chasnas, because the magefa ended, and there's almost like now there's a fire, there's a light. The Torah is being reborn. My father was nifter on the 32nd day of the Omer, which is Lamed Beis Omer, and we always like to say that my father had a great heart. He had a great heart. He was a wonderful, wonderful role model, wonderful person. And I think the two aspects of my father that I'd like to share with everybody, and to bring out my father's godless, was his tremendous dedication to Limud Torah and to teaching of Torah, but at the same time, his great, great heart, his great menschlichkeit, his great caring about people. And I've said over the story a few times about my father's dedication and love for Yidden, and how much he wanted to influence others to go on the path of Torah. With a story that took place in the early 1940s, there was a young man that came to learn in Eretz Yisrael from Ottawa, Canada. I said over the story this Shabbos to my children. It's all written in the book, but I like to say over the story. It's a great, great story. It really shows godless. And there was a young boy. His name was Harold Nadolny. Harold was a young boy from Ottawa, Canada. Also, similar, his father had sent him to learn in Eretz Yisrael, and he came for a year. And he was a younger boy. He had a very good head. And the Reshiva asked my father to be his Elter Rebacher and to learn with him. My father learned with him the whole year, and he really liked him, and he influenced him, and he got him into learning, and he really thought that he had great koiches. Then after the summer, this bacher didn't come back. El's man came, didn't come back. So my father went to the Rishiva and says, where's Nadolny? So he says, Nadolny's not coming back. It was the war years. The father had a scrap metal business in Canada, which then was a big, big thing because it was the wartime in Canada and the United States. They were trying to pick up to build up whatever they were going to use. Scrap metal, ships, tanks, who knows what there was going to be. And he wanted his son to work with him in the business. And he said he's not going to go back to yeshiva. A lot of people didn't understand the godless of Torah, and now business was more important. My father said to the yeshiva, he's such a great bacher, it's a chaval, that he shouldn't be involved in Torah. So the yeshiva said, no, what can we do? The father doesn't want to let him go back. Nothing we can do. My father said, if I go and try to convince him, and try to convince the father, the Yeshiva's masking, the Yeshiva said, yeah. So the Yeshiva gave my father money. My father took a train from those days, from Baltimore, Maryland to Montreal. It's probably like an 8-9 hour train ride. It was in the middle, it was already cold then, especially Montreal, Canada, very, very cold. Didn't have heat like they have in those days. In today's, the trains were not exactly like today. It was like old choo-choo train, choo-choo. And on the choo-choo trains, but it was, it wasn't the modern day trains today, not a speed machine. And then from Montreal, he transferred over to another train, took him to Ottawa. And he got to Ottawa. Where did my father stay when he got to Ottawa? There was no phones. He didn't have a phone number. Just went. When he got there, he opened up the telephone book in the train station. He looked for a rabbi, and he saw there was one rabbi in Ottawa, and he happened to be, he called that rabbi. That rabbi happened to be a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Oscar Z. Fassman, Rabbi Zelig Fassman, who became later on very well known in America. He was from Chicago, Illinois. He was the head of the Skokie Yeshiva. His son is the great Reb Chaim Fassman that passed away. He was Rosh Kollel in Los Angeles. There's a book just came out, just want to plug it, a book about Reb Chaim Fassman, written by my good friend, Reb David Fox's son, Reb Kiva Fox, who wrote a fantastic book about Reb Chaim Fassman. The first 2 chapters are all about Rabbi Zelig Fassman. And Rabbi Fassman Zatzal said to my father to come and stay in his house. He stayed in his house. And it was pretty divine providence, because later on, my father's brother-in-law, my late uncle, Reb David Kalman Rebbe, married Rabbi Fassman's daughter. So we became mechutonim and became relatives. And there's an end to the story, which we'll soon see how the Hashgacha Pratis works. But my father went, after he slept at night at Rabbi Fassman's house, he went to visit the Nadolnys the next day in the scrap metal business, and he wanted to convince the Bacher to come back. And the Bacher said, listen, I'd like to come back. My father doesn't let me. Try to convince the father, and the father said, no, it's more important for him to make money. He'll be kaveh, he'll learn, he'll daven. In those days, that's what the people did. And unfortunately, my father was not successful in getting Mr. Herbert Nadolny to come back. So at the end of the story, my father had to go back by train, go back to Baltimore. And you would say that the story ended there, It was almost like a wasted trip. My father went and tried to get a person to come back, and he wasn't successful. But there's a epitaph, there's an end to the story. The end of the story is that my father used to tell me that, Herbert Nadolny, that he once learned with, he became a big veer, he became an usher. He became one of the biggest real estate people in Canada. That's what my father had heard about him. And when my father was nifter in 1988, and I decided to open the yeshiva in his memory. So, and I had to go raise money for a fledgling yeshiva. I said, you know what, maybe I'll try to get some money from Mr. Nadolny. Maybe he'll want to support the yeshiva named after my father. And to make a long story short, I ended up meeting with Mr. Nadolny in Ottawa, Canada. And he gave me an appointment. And I came to his office. He wasn't really a Shomer Torah mitzvahs at that point. But he said to me, I want to donate to this yeshiva because your father was a very, very good person and a good man. And he was a good friend of mine. He ended up giving me $10,000 seed money in order to start the yeshiva. And so what I always say is that my father's efforts, going back 45 years prior to that, in the early 40s, paid back dividends, because that Mr. Herbert Nadolny was Zeiche to give money that our yeshiva was able to start, and our Yakov was able to start. And therefore, Schusa Yogan Olav. So you never give up. You never know when you're going to do a Maaseh Tov, how that Maaseh Tov is going to come out. My father had a story that, unfortunately, my father suffered from heart problems from a fairly young age. And that caused a lot of distress. And medically, he was sick. And at a certain point, he was literally in his early 40s. And at that point, they said the only thing that could possibly help him would be what's called bypass surgery. Today, bypass surgery is a relatively easy method. But in those days, in 1974, it was in its fledgling matzav. And we're going to speak about this story because this enters into the story, which is the first story in the book about a famous NBA basketball player, and how somehow he got intertwined into our lives and into my father's life. So the story goes like this. My father needed bypass surgery. There were two main places where you could do bypass surgery in those days. There was Houston, Texas, and there was a very famous world-class surgeon named Dr. DeBakey. And then there was Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and St. Luke's Hospital. And there was a surgeon by the name of Dr. Dudley Johnson. I remember hearing Dudley Johnson was 7 feet tall, or close. It was 6'7". Excuse me, it was 6'7". Very, very tall man. And my father's cardiologist, Dr. Tabatsky, Oliver Sholem, who was very, very dedicated to my father, said, "These are the two places, and you should pick which one you want." My father said he had heard that Dr. DeBakey had the best hands in the business, and he was one of the pioneers in the thing, but that by him everything was a conveyor belt. You just kind of like, you did the operation, you got onto the operating belt, and he just knocked off. He just knocked one after the other. He did a great job, but he heard that Dudley Johnson was a big mensch, that he didn't just, it wasn't a conveyor, but by him, every single individual was an individual. And my father said, "Ich will nicht sein a behema. I don't want to be a behema on the shchita. I want to be with a person that cares about it." There was a tremendous insight into that. So my father flew to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, together with my mother, Shbi Gesund und Stark, and my brother, Shbi Gesund und Stark, and Reb Michal Twersky, Shbi Gesund und Stark, was a Talmud of my father's, and he was Machnas Eirich, and then my father had this very, very severe operation. In those days, it was a very dangerous operation. It wasn't a simple thing. But Dr. Johnson said he feels he'll be successful. And he did a successful operation on my father. Now, the truth is, when I say successful operation, it gave my father, over 20-some odd years of quality life afterwards. Even more, 23, 24 years, I can't remember exactly how many. And because at that point, my father was not able to walk and he wasn't able to exercise all the things he had done in his youth. Very, very different type of life. And now Dr. Johnson was successful in his bypass surgery. But there was a big chiddush, because I remember at the time, they said the operation was supposed to take 3 hours, and they have to keep the blood flowing. And then at a certain point, Dr. Johnson saw that there was a very big problem. The operation ended up taking almost twice the time, 6 hours, which is really beyond the normal. And eventually, my father came out of the operating table. I remember the line that he said, and when he was getting out of the operating, he turned up, and when the anesthesia wore off, he turned to the doctor and said, "Doctor, got to tell you one thing." He says, "What do you want to tell me, sir?" "I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. That's what I want to tell you." And everyone had a big chuckle in the after surgery op room. And but what was amazing was, in those days, they didn't have microscopic surgery that we have today. They didn't have cameras. Everything, they have cameras going, the music is going. It's like a whole thing. Those days, it wasn't like that. Dudley Johnson had tremendous hands, and he had to sew my father's arteries, which were very, very ruptured and badly damaged from the heart disease. He had to do it with the feeling of his hands. And my father said that Johnson said, Rabbi Liff, I felt that God was holding my hands and helping me to make the operation with you. But I just saw recently that Dudley Johnson, Zochel Atoif, Dr. Dudley Johnson, when he was a young boy in Wisconsin, his mother taught him to knit and to sew. So he learned how to knit and sew. His hands were used to using very delicate needles and this and that. And that helped him when he made a decision he wanted to become a surgeon. He became a great surgeon because he knew how to knit and sew. Knitting and sewing was part of it. The Rebbeinu Shalom put a person into the world, which I feel he was there for many, many people. He saved many people's lives, but my father's life especially. Great, great Maisa. That's the Maisa of saving my father. Now the end of the story is really the real Knacker, the MBA story. The MBA story goes like this. So my father, when he went to the operation, he went to Milwaukee. My father loved Sfarim. Sfarim was like, if you take a look at my little collection of Svarim. My father had thousands and thousands of Svarim. My father's Yetzer Hara was Svarim. He used to say, Talmud Chacham Yetzer Hara Svarim. My father loved to buy Svarim. He didn't love to buy, he loved Svarim to learn them and to know them. Svarim was his lifeblood. It was his lifeblood. And whenever he went away on a vacation, he always would pack up a big box of all the Svarim that he felt he wanted to use for that kufa, and he would go with the Svarim. When he went for the operation, he took 2 boxes of Svarim. And before the operation and after the operation, that's what he was learning, especially after the operation, when he had the opportunity he said he just had kaiches because the blood was flowing. He had chidushi Torah that was coming out. It was gavaldik. His whole life changed because of that. And what happened was he flew back from Milwaukee on a flight together with my mother. And on that flight was a very famous NBA player. We'll keep his name quiet for now. This famous NBA player was a very, very tall, big, black, African-American, world-famous NBA player. And my mother at the time knew that I loved basketball. So she decided it'd be a great thing to get his autograph because my father was put into first class. So he was sitting together with this basketball player. Now at that time, that particular basketball player was changed his name and he took on a Muslim name because he became a Muslim believer. And he was not exactly, I would say, Jew-friendly, to the least. And the attendants on the flight said to my mom, I said, she wants to go over and get it. Maybe who is that? His name is, maybe we can get his autograph. He says, no, it's not worthwhile for you to get his name. My mother's like, maybe 5 foot tall. And this guy was close to 7 feet tall, maybe more than 7 feet tall. And so she decided she's not going to ask him for the autograph. And then the flight ended, and my father got off the plane, and we took his boxes, and we got his suitcases, and we went home. And then we got home, and it was an emotional time. My father called the Reshiva, and he was crying on the phone. The Reshiva gave him a bracha. A lot of stories behind that. I want to zero in on the NBA player part. And then we opened up the boxes. We don't see any Svarim. What do we see? We see a big color television set, which we never had. We saw what's called the boombox. Remember the boombox in the old days, the boomboxes? He said, Abba, did you kind of like switch to Svarim for the... My father didn't know anything. So we called the airline. We said, wrong box. Oh, yes, Mr. So-and-so, the NBA player, is very irate and he's very upset. And he's been asking, where's his boombox and where's the call? I said, well, they're here. We're sending a car to come pick it up. I said, well, it must have been exchanged and he must have taken the other boxes. And maybe the airline put the wrong tags. And that's why we got these tags instead of their tags. He said, we didn't hear anything about it. We'll ask him, but he hasn't told us anything about any books. And that was it. My father's farm, his precious farm, were lost. My father was very, very hurt. His precious farm was it was especially coming at the end of an operation, a heart operation. This was almost like a little shot. And then a few days later, we get a phone call. My father got a phone call from a person, a Jewish person, not religious. He said, is this Rabbi Liff? He says, yes. He says, I'm so-and-so. I live in Washington, D.C. Yes. And I was driving on the Baltimore-Washington Expressway, and I saw on the side of the road near the airport, I saw a bunch of Jewish books. I'm not religious, but I know what Jewish books are. So I stopped on the side, I opened them up, and I see your name is in them. And I picked them up. My father was so excited. And we got the Sfarim that were returned. But how did those Sfarim get on the side of the highway? Oh, someone must have thrown them out. Who threw them out? Now, we don't know for sure who threw them out. We can only conjecture who threw them out. My father was so upset that how could a person take Sfarim, which is literally the Kedusha and the lifeblood of a Jewish person, and just throw them onto the road. So my father said something. My father was not a type of person, a vindictive person. He said in Yiddish, and I'll just translate into English, he said, the person that threw those Sfarim should get a punishment, should be punished. The hand that threw those Sfarim should be punished. The following Friday night, that particular ball player was playing an NBA game, and he went up for a shot, and he missed the shot, and he got so upset, and he took his hand and he smashed it against the backboard or against the stantia of the thing, and he broke his hand and his arm in 3 or 4 places, and he was out for most of the season that season. And it was so clear that the words that my father had said, the hand was das getan, so bekommen a straf. The hand that did it, the holy words of my father had an effect. The connection to those holy svarim, that there was something that was taken away, that was a bizayon for those svarim, had a great effect. So that showed a little bit of the godless of what I grew up with, and I think that that's a great lesson that I want to share with you. I want to share with you one last story. Let's give me the story for tonight, and that has to. We had 2 stories. And the third story we'll say is the Rabbi Chanan story. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman Zecher Tzadik Livracha came to America. And he came for the yeshiva in Branovich. This was pre-World War II. And he came to Baltimore, and he gave a shir in the yeshiva. And my father heard that shir. My father was a young bacher. And then Rav Ruderman went around collecting money for him, helping to raise money for Branovich. And then Rav Elchanan went for Shabbos to Washington, to Rabbi Klavin's house, who I'm named after. And my father felt it was a great opportunity to be able to be together with Rabbi Chanan. And he went to Washington for Shabbos to his parents and to his mother, and he stayed by. And after davening, walking out of the shul, there weren't that many, people that understood how great a gadol was. But my father was together with the entourage, and they were walking Rabbi Chanan and Rav Klavin Zatzal back to the house. And Rabbi Chanan, seeing a yeshiva bacher in those days, there were very few yeshiva bacher in America. He saw my father was dressed like a yeshiva bacher, and he said, in Yiddish, Avu learns to, where do you learn? So my father said, I learned in Baltimore. He learns in Eretz Yisrael. He said, oh, you heard the shir today? Rabbi Chanan had said a shir in Erev Shabbos, and I said, yeah, you heard the shir. He said, you could say it over. The Kant says, Ibr Zogan. So my father was quiet, and my father hesitated, and he said, Ich hab nicht gechazert. I didn't yet review it. Later on, my father told us that he really knew the shir, but he hadn't done a full review on it. And Rabbi Chanan said a line to him which stayed for him for the rest of his life. Rabbi Chanan said, Nish gechazert is nish gelernt. If you didn't review it, you didn't learn it. Real learning is when you really make a chazar on it. And that statement went into my father, and it became like a very strong point in his life. That night he stayed up, he made a mishmer, and he chazed over the whole shir for Rabbi Chanan. And he really understood the shir well. And he went the next morning after davening, he went to Rabbi Chanan, and he said, I chazed the shir. So Rabbi Chanan said, no, I'll give it a shir. My father said over the whole shir, from beginning to the end, and he added on a kasha that he had, and a teretz that he had. And Rabbi Chanan was so happy and so joyous that a yeshiva baruch in America in those days, the late 30s, was learning Torah. And when he met Rav Ruderman the next day, when he went back to Baltimore, he said to the Rav Ruderman, with such Talmidim, like Rav Ruderman, what you're producing over here, you have nothing to be embarrassed from the yeshivas in Europe. You're producing the same thing as the yeshivas in Europe. And my father, that shir became a shir that he remembered for the rest of his life. Rav Ruderman would tell my father to say over that shir to Bachram. Later he said, Rabbi Yankov, say over the shir from Mochanan. And later on in life, my father became very ill. In the end of his life, there was a great Talmud Chacham, Reb Nachman Klein Zatzal, who came in to visit my father in the hospital, and he said, no. So my father was a little bit down and depressed, wasn't well. He said, Rabbi Yankov, say over the shir from Mochanan. My father said over the whole shir from beginning to end. He retained that shir. This week's parish is, so what we like to give over is that we see, my father had these 2 aspects. He had greatness in Torah and great normalcy. And I really feel that that's the message that he gave all of us. He had great midas. He was able to influence many, many people. He cared about Talmidim. And we feel that our small aspect of our Batzah Torah, both in Ner Yaakov and Ateres Yaakov, continues to carry his name with Rabbi Yakov, and these words should be Le'ila Nishmasai. And Mirz Hashem, we give a bracha to everybody that we should be Zeicha, that through our Habatzas Torah and our Amelis B'Torah and our caring about another person, which was a hallmark of what my father saw in his Rebbe and his Rebbeim, that we ourselves should emulate that. We should be Zeicher Mitzvah Shem to Mashiach Tzidkeinu Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Wishing everyone a wonderful, wonderful week. It should be a lebedike, gesunte, Lag BaOmer, Mitzvah Shem. We should be Zeicher to Yeshua's Nechamas for us and for ganz Klal Yisrael. Thank you very much for listening. We want to thank JFoundations.com. If you could sponsor any of our activities, it'd be another way of addressing and being able to give over Torah to other people. Go on the website and show your support. Thank you very much for joining us.